Hello, my name is Jennifer Smith, and I'm with Arlington County's Office of Communications and Public Engagement. Welcome, and thank you for joining the virtual community meeting where we're going to hear from the authors of the report on the Northern Virginia Juvenile Detention Center. We'd like to remind everyone that they can find the full report on the project webpage. And also, this session will be recorded for anyone who may not be able to attend this evening. And the recording also will be posted on the webpage after this evening. So tonight, we're joined by the Moss Group, an independent criminal justice consulting firm that was commissioned to do this analysis and to also share the report tonight. We also have staff from Arlington County, the City of Falls Church, and the City of Alexandria. And I'm going to do some short little intros as well right now. First, we have Dr. Wilkinson from the Moss Group, and then I'm going to go around starting with Alexandria.
Hi, Jennifer. Reggie Wilkinson with Senior Advisor with the Moss Group. You'll meet the rest of the team shortly, but we're very pleased to have participated with this project and happy to be here tonight.
Great. Mike?
Good evening. I'm Mike Mackey. I'm the Director of the Juvenile and Domestic Relations Court Service Unit in Alexandria.
Good evening. I'm Earl Conklin. I'm the Court Service Director for Arlington County and the City of Falls Church, and a member of the project team along with Mike and Janitha.
Great. Nancy?
And I'm Nancy Vincent with the City of Falls Church. I'm the Director of the Department of Housing and Human Services and the liaison with the court services units.
Great. And Janitha?
Hi, I'm Janitha McNair. I'm the Executive Director here at the Northern Virginia Juvenile Detention Center. I'm pleased to be here tonight.
All right, great. Thanks, everybody. And there are some other people that we'll introduce as we go on. So I just wanted to mention tonight, this session also follows a joint meeting that the Arlington County Board and the Alexandria City Council had on October 19th, where this report was initially presented. So following the report presentation, which will be about 20 minutes, give or take, attendees will be able to ask questions via the Facebook chat, or they can text their messages to the number that you'll see on the screen, and that number is 571-348-3053. And again, we'll also put that number on the screen in case you didn't catch it. So let's get started, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Reginald Wilkinson with the Moss Group for the presentation.
Thank you. Again, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you tonight virtually. Wish we could be in person, but you know, this is the deck that we've been dealt. So let's get started. A little bit about me. I'm the former director of the Department of Corrections in the state of Ohio, but I've had a lot of contact with juvenile services. I've served on Ohio's Juvenile Justice Commission. I've also been president of the American Correctional Association and the Correctional Leaders Association, and currently serve as the senior advisor for the Moss Group. Also joining me tonight are several other persons representing the Moss Group tonight. First is Dr. Mary Livers. She is also a past president of the American Correctional Association. She's managed juvenile justice in the state of Louisiana, but she's also had a lot of experience in both adult institutional corrections and parole and probation, and she is a consultant for the Moss Group. Also presenting tonight, in addition to Mary and me, is Carl Becker. Carl has a lot of experience. He's one of our technical experts and will be presenting a lot of the information on budgets. He has experience with cost-benefit analyses, master planning, and other kinds of expertise with operations on the federal and state level. So he is a senior vice president with the Carter Global Lead Companies. Not presenting, but behind the scenes for us today is Chris Eichenlaw. We call him Ike. He is retired from the Federal Bureau of Prisons, having been a deputy director and served in other capacities, but he's the staff person with the Moss Group who's managed this project from the beginning. Our technician and person who's been kind of the all-around coordinator for the project for us and program coordinator for the Moss Group is Prasan Gradaro, and she will be helping tonight as well with helping to manage some of the logistics for us. Also, we're very pleased to have the Moss Group company president with us, Andy Moss, and should we need her, she is in the queue. So we're very pleased to have a great team ready to assist Northern Virginia this evening. Next slide. You'll see, by the way, Prasan, if you can go back, just I want to point out the title of the project, and this is the formal title, is Cost Benefit Analysis of the Use of Northern Virginia Regional Juvenile Detention Center Alternative. So that is the formal title of the project that we're talking about this evening. So the agenda and what we plan to cover today include these items: background information on why this project, the Northern Virginia Juvenile Detention Center operations. We'll talk a little bit about what happens at the center. The strengths and challenges. No report of this nature would be worth its salt unless we talked about the strengths and challenges. And similarly, we'll present a financial analysis of what we discovered and uncovered as well. And then we will make some concluding remarks. And then following the concluding remarks, we will open it up for questions. Some of this may not be, a revelation to many of you, but it is very important to keep it in context. So nationally, juveniles are being placed in detention less frequently than what has been the case in recent years. The number of juveniles placed at the center in Northern Virginia has declined significantly over the past decade. This bar chart represents a 13-year perspective. 20,092 child care days in 2002 compared to 5,574 in 2019, which represents a 72% decrease. The color on the graphs don't necessarily mean anything, but the perspective in terms of the decrease over the last decade or 13 years is significant. So a number of tasks that we performed in order to get to the point that we're at right now is that we did a historical review in terms of compiling information from the documents that we've received. We did an analysis of national, state, and local best practices, innovations to make sure we had some focus for this project by comparing it to what we know about what's going on around the country. We did an analysis of existing center operations. We'll talk more about that. We did an evaluation for the potential for future regionalization of the Juvenile Detention Center with another jurisdiction. And we also did a comparative financial and services delivery analysis of the two proposed options to continue the operation of the center versus further regionalization of the center. And then we finally undertook a process whereby we would share the recommendations with various audiences. So the methodology included these steps. First, that we gathered a multitude of documents, did a historical review, financial analysis, and learn more about the operations of the center. We observed the center operations, we did not just look at the documents. We made sure that we had persons on site at the facility, observing and talking with personnel and others. We did a review and analysis of juvenile justice research. Again, best practices. We wanted to know what the center was doing compared to other jurisdictions. And this one was very critical for us as well, is that we did a community and stakeholder engagement, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in the next slide. So the community and stakeholder engagement, process, represents these items. There were 3 public meetings where we actually, gathered people, and we were extremely pleased with the turnout, with the questions, with the participation. So this was an important part of the process. Early on, we wanted responses from those persons who represented the community who wanted to respond, and 475 people did. The focus groups were conducted with the kids, the juveniles themselves, parents of the juveniles, and detention center staff. There were many other interviews and correspondence with elected officials, with local and state government officials, judges, attorneys, law enforcement, court officials, and nonprofit persons who represented nonprofit organizations that worked with or had some connection to the center. And we met with the Northern Virginia Juvenile Detention Center Commission. So a lot went into putting the report together. And at the top of that list of what was important is this community and stakeholder engagement. So the next slide, I'll turn over to Dr. Mary Livers.
Thank you, Dr. Wilkinson, and good evening, everyone. I will address some of the operational aspects of our report. But first, I'd like to sort of go over some milestones in the history of the evolution of the center. In 1956, City of Alexandria, Arlington, City of Falls Church, and Fairfax County established the Juvenile Detention Commission. And the commission was established with originally 7 members from the 4 jurisdictions. The commission owns the building, the land, and the assets. They also provide operational oversight of the operations of the facility. Just 2 years after the commission was formed, the Northern Virginia Juvenile Detention Center opened with a 30-bed capacity in 1958. Of course, what this means is it was designed in the mid-1950s. After 36 years of operation, the Fairfax County withdrew from the agreement and built its own facility in 1994. And the commission also manages the shelter care facility that's on the same property there, which Alexandria owns that building. With regard to the population characteristics, that would be next slide, please. The data we got from the Virginia Department of Juvenile Justice, and it shows there that the average age of a youth that's being served there in fiscal year 2019 was about 16.5 years old. There were 150 unique individuals that were served there. Some of those, of course, were also, I guess, repeat admissions. So the total amount of people admissions was higher than that, but 150 unique individuals. It the northern region of Virginia is no different than many places around the country with regard to disproportionate minority representation in their detention facilities. There you have 56.7% African American, 38.7% Caucasian, 4.6 indicated as other or unknown. With regard to ethnicity, 30.7% were Hispanic. Again, like other detention facilities across the country, most of the youth that are served in detention were male, 72%, and then 28% were female. The most common offenses for youth in the detention facility were probation violations, contempt of court, robbery, assault, larceny, narcotics. When we were there, our team went to the facility in September of 2019. There were 70.5 positions allocated to the facility. Over half of those are direct care staff who work directly with the youth on a day-to-day basis. The budget for 2020 is $5.8 million. The facility is certified by the Virginia Department of Juvenile Justice every 3 years, and the last one was in 2018, so they'll be doing another certification process in 2021. It is licensed for 70 beds. However, when we were there, they were operating with a staffing level for 42 beds. The average daily population there for youth is anywhere from 20 to 25, and that probably has gone down some since the pandemic. With regard to the operation of the center, we found that the center is conforming to contemporary best practices for a juvenile detention facility at this level of care. They do a very good intake. They do screening for mental illness and substance abuse, and they can be referred on for further help if necessary. The living areas have a lot of natural light, which we all know is very important. I would venture to say that not just some, but most of the rooms are decorated by the residents and seem to be very personalized. The school operates in a dedicated area that's set up just for school. So those, it very much would look like something you would think of as a school in the community. They operate, go back one slide, please. They operate a really good level system. The level system is used to encourage pro-social behavior, and this is also a best practice that's used in youth facilities all over the country. Is the best way to help manage the youth population. The facility itself they have common areas where the youth can spend some leisure time. The areas are colorful, they're decorated, and the furniture is appropriate and sturdy. The youth eat in the common area. I think it resembles sort of like a small school cafeteria. And there are adequate outdoor recreation opportunities. There's room there for large muscle exercise activities, sports like basketball, volleyball. There's also an indoor gymnasium recreation area for large muscle exercise when the weather is inclement. So the facility operates, one of the really great things about the operation of the facility is that there's really a robust schedule of activities for youth. It includes not only specialized programs, but also a variety of activities. As with most young people that age, their primary program is school. Just like youth that are in the community, they spend their day in school. The classes are offered by Alexandria City Public Schools. There's also 2 programs that are supported by the Virginia Department of Juvenile Justice that have benefit local youth. Just to name a few other programs, they have a New Beginnings program, aggression replacement training, which is a cognitive behavior. It is a research-based, evidence-based practice. And then you see there's a variety of other opportunities for growth and activity, pro-social activities. So the center is extremely, something went wrong. I can't see there it is, sorry. So the center is really doing a great job offering a lot of programs and activities to keep the kids engaged. Our task with the Moss Group was to analyze 2 options. The first one was to look to see whether the center should remain open and perhaps implement cost containment strategies. And the second was, in fact, to close the facility and contract for beds at other nearby detention centers. Prince William County, that facility requires more infrastructure improvements. It was found to have limited program space, and they also indicated that they had no interest in providing services for out-of-county residents. Youth. Loudoun County facility was also had a limited capacity, and in fact, it stated that they're planning on developing their own new facility, and also expressed no interest in contracting for supporting youth from outside Loudoun County. Initially, Fairfax County looked to be a possibility. However, as time went on, they indicated a lack of interest also in providing detention services to other detention services. So with that, I will pass it on to Carl to talk about the cost per day analysis.
Thanks, Mary. One of the things that we wanted to do to get some context for the analysis is look at the cost of Northern Virginia compared to some of the other nearby facilities. So the costs you see here are costs per day for resident that are reported by all these facilities to the state of Virginia. And you can see that Fairfax has by far the highest cost at $889 per resident per day, followed closely by Northern Virginia. And then the other jurisdictions have much lower costs. All these facilities have somewhat low utilization rates, except for Merrimack. But you can see probably the driving factor here in terms of why Fairfax and Northern Virginia have higher costs is their staff expenses per resident are much higher than the other jurisdictions. And this goes to probably both staffing patterns and the fact that the cost of living and salary levels and the labor market in the immediate Fairfax, Northern Virginia area are somewhat different from the rest of the state. And that, in fact, drives up staff costs for those facilities. Next slide.
One of the things we wanted to look at was the overall strengths of the operation, and then we'll also talk about, because whenever you have strengths, you have challenges. I haven't found anywhere that has a perfect layout and a perfect operation yet, although it's a great thing to strive for. But beginning with the strengths, there is widespread community support for the operation of the center. In addition to that, the commission works really well with the leadership to make improvements and implement cost containment strategies. The center's operational philosophy is therapeutic. This reflects the national best practices, and this has been something that has been evolving in juvenile corrections for a long time, and we're finally starting to see some good traction with this. The center is a youth and family-centered operation. The programs that are provided are trauma-informed, they're gender-responsive, and again, they're therapeutic. The leadership there is concerned about staff well-being. This is very important as part of developing a healthy culture. As stated before, there's a wide range of quality programs and services that are there and available. One of the things that's real important is that families have access to the facility and that the youth remain closer to their families and in their home communities. One of the pluses to the facility is that public transportation is readily available, and that makes it very family friendly. In addition to that, one of the strengths of the facility is it does have some extra room there, and I think there's some opportunity to be creative if needed or desired to enhance programming or even reach out to some other ways to utilize that extra space. We mentioned the strengths. We also have some challenges that we wanted to acknowledge and discuss. The first one being that the center serves youth with serious offenses and complex behavioral health issues. And of course, that makes sense that as the population goes down, this level of care should really only be used for those youth who have that type of serious situation or complex behavioral health issues. Along with that, the staff did not feel like they have enough mental health clinicians there to meet the need that they're currently experiencing. So that is a current challenge. Another challenge, of course, is just the cost to operate. It's the second highest cost per day among the 24 detention centers. And so that continues to be something that is considered a tough thing to overcome. It's just expensive to run detention centers. The center's age and design, it was built and conceived of in the 1950s. It is somewhat a hardened physical plant. It's much more difficult to make that kind of facility look home-like and less intimidating. I think the staff has done a really good job trying to work with what they have, but at the end of the day, it is an older facility and did not have home-like environment in mind when it was built. The center is old. With all aging physical plants, there are capital needs, and the center is in need of some capital improvements. It should also be acknowledged that some community members are opposed to any form of juvenile detention. I will pass it on now to Carl so he can review the FY20 budget.
Thank you, Mary. What you see here is the FY20 enacted budget that was put forward for the center. It totaled $5.8 million, and about 80% of that goes for salary and benefits, which is typical for what we see of these types of facilities. Against that operating expenditure, the center received about $2.2 million from the state of Virginia in operating subsidies and net revenues from 2 programs that they operate at the center, the CAP program and the CPP program. So after you net out the revenues from the operating expenditures, that leaves about $3.6 million that the jurisdictions of Alexandria Falls Church and Arlington County have to pick up and divide amongst themselves. And that averages out for those jurisdictions at about $652 per day. Next slide, please. So we looked at the budget and we looked at the operations to see what possible efficiencies could be achieved to reduce that operating cost and achieve some a more cost-effective way to operate the facility. And we came up with these recommendations. Analyzing the security staff pattern to reduce the overtime, which was substantial. We also recommended reducing the overall staffing for the facility by 6.5 positions, and this concentrated in the administration, program, and operations area. We didn't touch security per se. These are a consolidation of program and largely administrative responsibilities. The center had implemented some variety of different efficiencies to achieve cost savings, and those need to be reflected in the budget. Some technology updates in the HR systems and business technologies would also yield some savings. We also thought they needed to take a longer-term look at the capital needs because to the extent you defer maintenance, those bills will catch up with you at some point and represent a long-term financial liability for the center. That needs to be factored into future financial planning. We also looked at adding a community placement program for males. This is a state program, and adding that, the center currently operates one for females, and adding a program for males would result in a net revenue increase for the center from the state. And then we also recommended looking at some type of program or service to be utilized in Unit 7, which was vacant at the time that we examined the operations of the facility. Next slide, please. So the impact of these, of all these recommended efficiencies, the most significant of these are the staff reduction recommendations, which those 6.5 FTEs in effect save you about $372,000. The introduction of a new CPP program initiative from the state of Virginia would result in a net increase in revenue from the state of $223,000. So between those two actions, the reduction in staff costs and the increase in revenue from the state, the jurisdictional expenditures, that portion of the operating cost that has to be picked up by Alexandria Falls Church and Arlington, goes down to just slightly over $3 million, which equates to about $545 per resident day, a substantial decrease from the current jurisdictional cost. Next slide, please. And this shows you how that how those savings are allocated. So the current funding allocation among these 3 jurisdictions is $3.6 million. Implementing the staff reduction and implementing the program initiative brings that allocated cost down to $3 million, saving nearly $600,000 for these jurisdictions. Next slide.
Okay, so thank you, Carl, and thank you, Mary. This is our last formal slide, and then we'll be prepared to respond to questions. But a few concluding remarks. One, nearby juvenile detention centers are not viable options, so it's not something that we're recommending for detaining Northern Virginia youth. The Northern Virginia Juvenile Detention Center can reduce costs without compromising programs and services. We think that there may be some administrative ways that that can take place. We'll put that in the hands of local officials, but we endorse cost reduction, but we also believe that compromising programs is not a good idea as well. The majority of stakeholders and their community members voiced their support for Northern Virginia Juvenile Detention Center. Keep in mind, this was not a statistical review, so we don't have that kind of data. But we stand by all the interviews, all the responses that we've gotten to come to this conclusion that the center and its operation is widely supported. Space is available at the Northern Virginia Juvenile Detention Center for repurposing. Again, there are a lot of possibilities there. Some have been proposed that are not as viable, but again, this is something that has to be discussed moving into the future. Some community members advocated for closing the center and eliminating juvenile detention altogether. This is not a new notion around the country. There is a lot of discussion about decarceration, about moving persons out of detention facilities, whether they're adult or juvenile. This is not something that we're recommending, but for those persons who aspire to this particular notion are well entitled to their positions. And finally, the Moss Group, recommends partnering with Annie E. Casey Foundation, and their Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative. Annie E. Casey is one of those organizations in the country that's been thought leaders about juvenile justice and innovations and best practices for many, many years. And they actually fund, in many cases, those programs and services that work. So this is another thought to keep in mind. So that concludes our formal report, and I'll turn it back over to Jennifer.
All right, great. Thank you so much. I wanted to remind all of the viewers out there that there's a couple ways you can ask a question if you have one. You can text your question to the number that appears on the screen. I believe it's still there. Or you can paste or put your question into the chat on Facebook. So we've got a couple different ways you can ask a question. We have a first question from someone on Facebook, which is probably a fairly simple one, which it has to do with the age of residents. Are there any residents age 18 or older at the facility? So I'm not sure who the best is. If it's somebody from Moss Group, maybe Janitha?
Janitha may be the best person.
Great, okay. Janitha, do you want to unmute and answer that one for us?
Sure. So we do currently have children that are 18 or older. A couple of them are local children, and 3 more are children that are part of our long-term program that we have through the Department of Juvenile Justice.
Okay, great, thanks. We have another question from Facebook. Staff mentioned that they need more staff for mental health, for example. So why then is there a recommendation for a reduction in staff? And perhaps somebody, Dr. Wilkinson from the Moss Group, might be able to expand on that?
Yeah, Mary, what do you think?
Well, we support the recommendation. We support that there should be additional mental health professionals in that staffing pattern. And Carl, I can't remember if we added that into the final recommendation for the staffing or not, but we support that. We think that in that regard we need additional coverage.
Yes, we did take that into account, and in fact, the reduction in staffing is largely in administrative and operational support positions. We didn't really want to touch the program positions or the security staffing.
All right.
Great.
Janitha, did you have something else to add to that, or?
No, I was just going to emphasize the point that Carl made, that the reductions were administrative positions that could be more efficiently managed within the facility with current positions we have, and none of those cuts were positions that work directly with the children.
Great.
We have a question, kind of as the daily populations continue to decline, is there a point at which the MOS group would, reconvene the group or reconsider the decision to keep the center open? I don't know if that's a MOS group question or maybe a Mike or Earl question.
Well, just for the, just making sure folks know that our engagement is basically over, with the Northern Virginia Juvenile Detention Center with our RFP. So I do think that, questions like that in terms of future decisions rest with the political officials and administrative officials of Northern Virginia.
Okay. Mike, did you want to add something there? It looked like you had your finger raised.
Jennifer, I just mentioned that the next steps include a team looking at the recommendations and going through the different elements, including population and trends. And I think that's a part of our next steps, which will be included. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Let's see. We've had another question on Facebook, perhaps for Janitha, or I don't know, maybe Mike or Earl. I'll let you guys decide and wrestle this one. Could somebody speak maybe about the feasibility of the recommendations and how eliminating the positions may or may not impact the quality of programs and services?
I'll start.
Great.
So again, I'd like to reiterate that when everything was reviewed, positions that directly touch the children or the programming provided to the children or services for our children, those positions were relatively unscathed. And I do believe there were a couple of positions that were added or recommended for us to buttress our already robust programs. Those positions we looked at were, whether we needed 2 people for human resources or could it be 1 person, or how many, administrative support staff did we actually need, and could any of those positions, be combined? And some of them were redundant, and, they had just been positions that had been here for a long time and had not been looked at critically. And we finally had an opportunity to do that. And certainly we've already begun to make changes with those administrative positions and focus on putting our resources behind services that directly touch the children.
Great. Mike, Earl, anything to add? If not, we'll move on.
I don't have anything to add to that question. I would like to go back to the one before it, though. I think and it may come up again in another question, but sizing the facility to meet the needs of the county is something that we might need to consider down the road. That may be a capital project or something else. But as we continue to decline in our use of the facility, if that occurs, and I think that is the trend, that there will be some need to look at the facility again from the standpoint of what is it the community needs, and making sure that we're sized to the appropriate facility.
Okay, great. Thanks for adding that. We have a question. Is shelter care still part of the facility? Is that Janitha maybe, or?
Well, I can answer that. Also, shelter care is a critical service. It is not part of the facility per se. It is adjacent to the facility. Both are operated by the Juvenile Detention Commission, and under Janitha's directorship as the executive director. But shelter provides a non-secure option for youth that come into the court system or into foster care. And it is a critical resource in us reducing the use of detention, of not placing kids in secure detention if we have other options. And part of what I think all 3 of our jurisdictions have done is tried to expand the options to detention. So when you look at the decline over the last decade or more, you see that is partly due to the use of alternatives to detention, such as shelter care or detention diversion, outreach detention, other resources that our courts have been able to put in place and our communities have been willing to support in order to reduce the placement of kids in detention. And that's why the number has gone down so much. And shelter care is I think, a critical component of that array of services.
Okay, great. These two questions I've got two different questions, but they're a little bit connected to schools. So I'm going to try to maybe put them together. One is, or part A is, did the study consider the administrative practices of the respective school systems? And then how does the center work with the local public school system? So maybe the Moss Group for one part. I'm not sure they can answer the part B piece.
Okay, Carl or Mary?
I guess I don't understand the question entirely, because the school system is supported by the Alexandria system, the city school district, and I mean, it's a regular school program, and so yeah, I mean, we looked at the operation, and they seemed to be fully staffed. They were totally engaged, and it looked to be a good operating school. Janitha, do you want to talk about the part B of that?
So can you repeat the question, Jennifer, so that I'm clear?
The second part, or these are maybe two different people asking these questions, but the second part also had to do with schools. How does the center work with the public school system or systems?
So we largely, that's done through our school, which is a high school that's run by Alexandria City Public Schools. We have our principal, guidance and support staff that communicate with schools that our children are already members of in the community, to make sure that there's a continuity in their education programming, and that they can pick up and test and even graduate. We have children here who graduate high school when they've completed their classwork and participate in college courses. So I hope that I'm addressing the question, but we work hand in hand with our partnership with Alexandria City Public Schools. And for our children who don't attend Alexandria City Public Schools outside of here, then our principal and our staff work with their home schools to make sure that there's a continuation of their educational program and support.
Okay, good. Thank you. Hopefully that gets a little bit at what the person or persons were asking. Switching gears a little bit, somebody's asking, how can the results of the study be expanded to adult facilities? Any thoughts on that from the Moss Group, maybe?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Andy Moss if she wants to respond to that.
Okay. Andy, you might have to unmute and
yes. Well, call the Moss Group and we can talk to you about that. Yeah, and I don't know if I'll have another chance in here, but I want to thank the folks involved in this for us to have the opportunity. And but yes, certainly we're located right here in DC and around the country, so happy to talk about that.
Okay. Let's see, I'm scanning through some of our questions. Okay, this is an interesting one, and I'd like to learn a little more myself. Can you say a little bit more about the opportunity to partner with the Annie E. Case Foundation? What kind of financial or programmatic support might they offer?
So I'd like to start with that. We're excited about the recommendation, and the Annie Casey Foundation has the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, which is a nationwide program, and in fact, we've gone ahead and had discussion to set up a meeting to discuss the possibility of that happening in our area. In fact, we have a meeting next week with the Department of Juvenile Justice State JDI coordinator, and this is it's a really exciting time in juvenile justice. The Virginia Department of Juvenile Justice has been a part of a transformation relative to responding to juvenile crime and to try to help youth and families with such things as structured decision-making tools and better decisions so that we can impact, even though juvenile crime is trending down, are we doing the best practices across the state? And it's a great time to be a part of this, and JDI is another step in that direction, because these initiatives really talk about making objective decisions relative to kids, and this speaks about justice by geography, the prevention of that, racial and ethnic disparity, and the like. So we're excited about JDI. At this point in time, we have a meeting set up to discuss this, and we're going to pursue it as much as we can. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot that Casey Foundation does. One of the things that I think is just amazing that they do is their work with families, and the whole idea of family engagement is a very critical component in juvenile justice. It's a very critical component in any kind of education. That time that I served on the Ohio State Board of Education, that was the code word for success. And if any juvenile justice agency can get assistance with issues such as that, then you'll be much better ahead to do that.
This might be still with you, Dr. Wilkinson. Another question, how effective would it be to transform the center into a resource center for underserved youth? And examples of sexual and mental health, housing services, or assistance?
I think it's a good idea. There are some cautions, however, because it's generally not a good idea to mix persons who've been justice involved with persons who haven't been or who are civilian. It is a good idea that you share resources if that's possible. If there are separate facilities, that's one of the ways you can tackle some of the staffing and some of the mental health, some of the emotional or intellectual disabilities issues. There are a lot of concerns. There are sex offenders and so forth. So there are a lot of issues that kind of cross-tabulate themselves between populations that are not just as involved and those who are, but you have to be careful about what that mix looks like.
Okay. Another question for maybe somebody on your team there. What are the Moss Group's thoughts on the idea of a major capital project to remodel the facility, make it more therapeutic, dormitory style, if money were no object? And maybe based on things you've seen in other parts of the country even.
So, Carl, this is what you do. So what do you think about that?
Well, looking at it as a money guy, the facility already has a very, very high cost per resident, per child, and substantial renovations of the facility that's not intensely utilized. I don't know that makes a lot of sense in the grand scheme of things. Just from a cost and budgeting standpoint. Mary, you may have some thoughts on what you see around the country in terms of different types of residential models for this type of facility.
Well, if money is no object, of course, money is always to be considered, but there's two choices. One is to take what you have and see if you can make it better. And weigh that against maybe the opportunity to have a brand new start with another facility, and then compare the two in terms of what's more manageable. It is always difficult to take a facility that's that old and make it something so desirable that it might win some kind of architectural award or something. I mean, it is what it is. It was built in the 50s. It's hardened. And, there may be some adaptations that could be done to make it feel less intimidating and so forth. But in many cases, it might be best just to start from scratch and go with a new envisioned modern contemporary style structure that's sized and envisioned for modern contemporary juvenile justice programs. So that's a study in and all itself, as you know.
Yeah, it's my experience that you can only retrofit a facility so much, before it starts to, not, achieve your purpose.
Some people call that trying to put lipstick on a pig. So, but sometimes it just depends on the jurisdiction. Sometimes you can take what you have and make the best of it. And if that's where the jurisdiction wants to be, then that's where it is. If other options are available, then it's certainly worth looking at.
Okay, good, thanks. Another question here, and this one's came in. We've actually had a couple of them come in by text as well as via Facebook. What do those who are against youth being detained see as alternatives to serious crimes? Would we put them in adult jails like several states do now? Any thoughts from any of our presenters or the jurisdictions on this?
I can say that there is absolutely no chance that our jurisdictions would put a juvenile in an adult jail without there being a legal process to certify a youth as an adult, and that very rarely happens, certainly in Arlington County and Falls Church and Alexandria. So there is not an option really to put youth. It's against the regulations. Jails have to be certified to handle juveniles, and that is not a setting we want to put our children in. So I think there's no desire or intent to do that. So I don't really see that as an option. Without the option of partnering with another jurisdiction, I think our jurisdictions are in the position of needing to manage a facility and bring it to the capacity that serves the need we have and the demands of our jurisdictions. There are youth that are going to need to be detained. There's always going to be some serious offenses, usually violent felony offenders, that at least for some period of time will be held securely. And I think our jurisdictions are in a position where that needs to be provided somehow, because adult jails would not be an option anyone would support.
Okay. We've had a question. I'm going to maybe take a couple of questions because they're related or could be related. First question was any consideration to expanding alternative programs like Arlington's New Directions High School to serve the population? And then a related kind of question was, does the center work with organizations like Argus House?
Nita, you want to try that one?
So I'm going to defer that one really to our court service unit directors, because those, when children, they're either sent to us for secure care or they get court orders to go to shelter. And of course, our children do go to our shelters, but I think that's better answered by one of the CSU directors.
I love this question because it gives us a chance to talk about what our jurisdictions offer besides detention. We have an array of services that we provide to our youth who are court involved. New Directions is a wonderful alternative school program, and it works with many of the kids that are under court supervision of some kind very successfully. It is a smaller, more focused, supportive environment. It is a wonderful partnership between Arlington Public Schools and our courts. And I can't tell you how effective it is and how much we as a court system rely on that partnership. Alternative schools make a big difference. The school at the detention center is extremely effective also for the time that kids are there. And the principal and the teachers there coordinate with Arlington Public Schools and Falls Church City and Alexandria Public Schools. Even though the students are enrolled in Alexandria Public Schools while they're at the center, they work very diligently to make sure they know what work the kids are working on in Arlington or Falls Church as well, and make that happen. In addition to detention, we have our group homes. Argus House was mentioned, and Aurora House is the program for girls. These provide very supportive services to kids and their families. They are alternatives to detention. Kids may go to detention, but because we have these programs, their length of stay is often very short, much shorter than it would be otherwise, because we can transition them to a classroom like New Directions. We can transition them to one of our group homes if that's needed, where they get family counseling. And we also have our 2 after-school programs, Young Achievers for boys and Girls Outreach for girls. These are the equivalent in many ways to a day reporting program, which is one of the best practices suggested by the Annie Casey Foundation. So we have just a plethora of resources beyond detention, such as what this question refers to in New Directions and our group homes, Argus House.
Jennifer, if I may just add, just take the opportunity to talk about Alexandria for a few minutes, and similar to Arlington and Falls Church, and really following a pattern across the Department of Juvenile Justice of Virginia, and really because starting with the support of the locality, there are many programs, and like Earl said, most of the youth that we come in contact with don't end up in detention. In fact, the trends, of course, through after study with Annie Casey and others across the state, and the support of diversion in Alexandria, they're a third to 40-50% of youth that come in contact with the Juvenile and Domestic Relations Court Service Unit, we end up diverting successfully. In fact, diversion works almost 90% of the time. So we're really proud of that, of the fact that we're trying to solve issues, and diversion is an opportunity to hold someone accountable, provide services, and send them on their way. And so that's one of the efforts. In addition, as I mentioned before, with standardized structured decision making, we're able to assess youth with youth assessments and also other measures. And our probation officers are trained in national best practice, effective practices, and community supervision. And so when youth are in our contact, the numbers have gone down so that we are able to focus on those that most need our support and help. And working with the courts, working with our partners in social services and mental health and others in the community is very important. In Alexandria, we have 2 licensed family therapists on staff. We have staff that are dedicated to working in case management mostly for diversion cases, and we have gang prevention efforts and also involvement in the community, with community members being involved in the justice system. For example, the mentoring partnership, which has existed for years now, involves community members, some of whom may be on this call, who mentor a youth for an hour a week for a year. And we've been able to recruit over 1,000 mentors in the last decade. So we're really proud of those efforts. And we also want to give a lot of focus, obviously, to some of those most in need, the youth who are in detention and shelter care. Thanks.
Mike and Earl, since you're talking a little about some of these other services, one of the questions from Facebook was, has the introduction of work study programs or pre-work study programs been considered at the center? Or Janitha, maybe. I'm
That's
not
a good
sure.
question for Janitha.
So we do have programs that we partner again with our school system for that. Because as was pointed out earlier in the discussion, a large part of the day is when our children are either in high school or in college courses or in work study or work, the world of work, right? What jobs might they be interested in? What courses do they need for certification? So we have children that work towards various certifications while they're here. We have children that are currently enrolled in college, in Tidewater Community College. We're working on a partnership with Nova. And so we recognize the value in preparing our children for the world of work, because not all of our children will go to college. Some are looking at the military. We've had, military recruiters talk to some of our children, those who have been specifically interested in that, and just making sure our children know what their options are to further themselves and to look toward adulthood with a positive focus, and with a view that they fit in and it's for them, right? So we do have work programs in the facility for certain children as well. That is something I'm very interested in working closer with our communities to partner with. We've had children that have had jobs in the community. We take them to work after school. We pick them up after they're off work. And that is something I've been, very excited about since coming on here and being here for the last 3 years, because having worked in another state, that wasn't always an option or even welcomed. And here it's fully embraced, and our children have taken advantage of that. And it really gives them something solid and stable when they transition back to their communities. They get to keep those jobs. And just like any other teenager with a job, they go to school back when they're back home and they go to work. So I think there's great opportunity to continue, to continue the discussion about efforts towards work study and work opportunities for our children who are eligible to do that. So I'd love to have more opportunity in that area for children.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go backwards a little bit to a question that we had come in on Facebook that I don't think we've answered yet. How do the center's utilization trends compare to other centers around the country in the recidivism rate in comparison to other centers? And that's probably a Moss Group question, I'm guessing. So
I want to ask Mary if she wants to chime in on that question.
Great.
As far as the trends across the country, what Northern Virginia is experiencing is being experienced all over the United States in terms of as evidence-based programming and risk assessments and structured decision-making are implemented, and juvenile crime is going down. The facilities across the country are facing the same thing. They're depopulating, and they started off with a large number, a big physical plant operation based probably on the building phase we went through in the 90s. And then now we're reducing population. So the analysis that you all are undergoing is not uncommon across the country. I forgot the second part of that question.
Recidivism rates.
Recidivism rate. I don't have any really good way to talk about recidivism rates. Recidivism rates are just a real tricky thing because everybody calculates a little bit differently. It's very rare that you would have any one facility that was keeping it just the same way as everybody else. So the best way to really use recidivism data is to compare your own performance against yourself. So in that sense, it's helpful. But to try to compare the recidivism rate of Northern Virginia facilities to anywhere else would be pretty much an invalid comparison.
Great, thanks. We did have a question about the process going forward for developing policies for the center's future and the status of the report or the Moss Group report. Maybe Mike, you want to address that? We did touch on that earlier, but maybe just kind of touch on that one more time.
Yes, so representatives from the project team and other colleagues in the jurisdictions will be getting together and reviewing the report and to provide some further discussion and recommendations to the elected bodies and moving forward. So there'll be a lot of attention given to this study over the next 6 months, and where we can move forward in some ways, as I mentioned earlier, some such like JDI and et cetera, we'll be moving forward in that direction. However, we will be providing feedback to the elected bodies in a number of months.
Great. For viewers out there, just a reminder, if you have a question, you can send it in via text, or you can put it in the Facebook chat if you have access to that. We do have a question that just came in via text, it looks like. What are the equity practice, or what equity practices are in place or planned for the most vulnerable and marginalized youth and families?
I could start with that, and then I'd ask others to chime in. But as I mentioned before, part of it comes down to creating objectivity in our decisions in as much as possible as we can, and throughout the state, across DJJ, the structured decision making begins at the onset of a case. So such things as the detention assessment instrument is completed prior to the decision of whether a youth would be recommended for detention immediately in terms of interactions with law enforcement at the time. And then following that process, as I mentioned earlier, there are objective assessments that give us a sense of the risk of situations and the appropriate services to provide. And what this is meant to do is to give us a sense of what we should put into place for any kid, no matter what their background is. And then also a fairly new process is the standardized disposition matrix, so that probation officers, when they're asked to do a report to the court, they use a tool and also their professional judgment as well, and provide the court with a recommendation which, compared to others across the state, across other probation officers, would be similar in nature. And as I mentioned earlier, this does talk about not only justice by geography, but also the equity issue, which is at the forefront, really, in much of the discussion. In addition to that, I would mention that, and I'll defer, of course, to Earl for more specifics about this, but Alexandria 2 years ago participated in the Georgetown Racial and Ethnic Disparity Program cohort, and Arlington did the year before then. So the program calls for jurisdictions to recognize disparity that may exist in their community, and to work on that and to study. And there was a team that got together that included representatives from Department of Juvenile Justice, the Common Attorney's Office, the Public Defender's Office, Social Services, Court Service Unit, law enforcement, the schools, detention center, and others, the judiciary. And we looked at the issue not only from a national perspective, but we looked at it relative to our locality. And so this team has gotten together to look more deeply into our system, and we want to do more in this area, and we want to be to make changes and to impact equity in a major way.
Great, thank you. I'm going back to a text question that we had, and this is a little bit going back to schools, but a little bigger question. How has the increase in school resource officers in the last decade affected detention rates? And should school systems continue employing school resource officers? And I'm assuming that's something maybe Moss Group could address.
Actually, the trend is going away from school resource officers right now, especially with all the social justice issues, that are taking place. The schools are now not wanting uniformed personnel walking through the hallways. So it doesn't mean that they don't want security, that they don't want to have a focus on safety, but the concept of schools resource officers is morphing somewhat. So I think if the focus is more on safety, more on reintegrating, kids back into the community, understanding the safety piece, that may be where the focus is going to lie in the future. It doesn't mean folks are going to wholesale start getting rid of school resource officers. There's national associations, state associations, all named after school resource officers. But there is a trend that we see that's a little bit different than what it was even a year ago.
Great, thank you. Again, this is probably now moving back to people who are close to the center. Has any consideration been given to the shelter care building and moving it to the unused areas of the detention facility to consolidate resources, save money, and then any thoughts? How much does shelter care cost to run separately?
I'm not aware of any specific discussion that has happened related to that. I will say that there was some experience that Janitha led around COVID and using the vacant space as a quarantine shelter for youth who were charged with offenses but needed a place to go or could not go to shelter because they needed to quarantine. And I think that was an effective use of it. I think the Juvenile Detention Commission and the jurisdictions are going to look at that shared space, and that will certainly and could be certainly and will be part of that consideration, how best to maximize the space that we have. And consolidation, I would say, is certainly not off the table, but it's not something that we have explicitly discussed at this point yet.
That's great. Thanks.
Can I go back to the previous question that had to do with vulnerable and marginalized youth? Because I think our center has done some good work that needs to be, I think, a little more described by Janitha related to working with LGBTQ youth that may have been referred to the center, how those kids are provided for. I don't know if Janitha wants to address that or not.
So, sure. So we've been very focused on individualizing care for children, which can be tricky in detention because it's, in and of itself, it's supposed to be a short experience, right, for children. But, what my philosophy is that whether it's an hour or a week you spend in detention, it is impactful, right? What that child experiences once they enter these doors affects them. And as long as it's in my control, I want a child to feel safe and significant here and cared for. And what we know is that our LGBTQ community is often not thoroughly, our children aren't, their needs and how they feel about their care isn't always considered, right? And here at this center, it is, since walking in here, it's been my goal to ensure that every child here is heard and their needs are met. We take how they feel about their care into consideration and we work from that, right? So we've had the experience of having transgender residents here who might have been other places and who might not have been able to feel safe in their identity in those places. And here we definitely work to ensure that our children are respected in their sexual orientation and gender identity, and that we don't house children according to necessarily birth assignment at birth, right? We talk to a child and we get to understand that child, how they see themselves, how they feel safe or not in this environment. And then we work committedly to make sure that child is safe and respected. And so that has created all kinds of opportunities for us to learn how to be the best, safest place we can be for children when they're here. And we're fully committed to that. My staff is. I'm a prison rape elimination auditor, which is a federal, I was certified federally to audit jails, prisons, and detention centers to ensure that the rights of the LGBTQ community and practices and programs and staff training are all considered in such a way that our population is safe, right? And so I've had the unique experience since being here, even having worked in a neighboring state for several years, being able to really be true, to walk truly in that, to meet a child at intake and to see what that child's needs are, how they see themselves, and affect their safety that way, right? So we assign them to units based on an objective screening tool, but our children fully participate in what's going to happen to them during their stay, you know, what they wear, how they're treated, what they're called, right, and how they're addressed. And so that we've been successful in that. It's, you know, it takes a lot of training and a lot of commitment and a lot of consistency, but I'm very proud of that work that we've been able to do here and to continue to be fully committed to implementing practices that keep all of our children safe, and especially our most vulnerable population, which can and often is the LGBTQ community in confinement settings. So I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. Thank you. I think we're getting near the end of our questions now. We have, looks like maybe one final question, unless another one's popping up here. Did the report recommend detention alternatives that don't currently exist? Perhaps that's one for the Moss group.
Ike, are you on the line?
Might need to unmute.
Yes, I can take that. The study was specifically, we were asked specifically to address two things. One is what improvements or changes can be made to the existing detention center, and what are the possibilities for alternative detention sites. We were not tasked with exploring what are the alternatives to detention altogether, and so the report does not address that. In hindsight, that may have been something that those who formulated the tasks in the RFP and the study might have considered, but at the time we were only tasked with exploring detention options.
We do have another important question, and it does touch on some of the topics that I think Mike and Earl spoke about earlier, but this has to do with the data reflects that the detention facility appears to lock up more Blacks and Latinos. And given that our country is working, trying to work away from this, why would we keep the facility open? Dr. Wilkinson, maybe you can talk about part of this, and then Mike and Earl, I think you might have some items to add on this important question as well.
Yeah, I'm going to give that to Mary. She's talked about that in her presentation on some of that data. So.
Well, what I would say is that you know, work does need to be done on the disproportionate minority representation, and that's been alluded to by Mike and Earl, and I know everybody's going to be focused on that, and there are ways to address this, and I know that there's going to be a lot of good information, a lot of good ideas that are going to be coming forth from the field to be looking at that. But I would just mention that detention is part of it's part of that continuum of care. You know, it's the last resort for the most difficult cases that come across that are highly aggressive youth or kids that have assaultive behavior or have some serious charges, felony charges. So detention, it should not be overused. The systems are in place not to overuse detention. We've heard over and over again that once a child is in need of detention in a secure setting, that they should stay there only the amount of time that it takes for them to stabilize their behavior and go back before the court and go back to the community as soon as possible. But it is a level of, it is in that continuum and is necessary, I think, for communities to have access to this kind of operation. Again, used rarely, and when used, use it only for the least amount of time that's necessary. Conditions while there should be just like is going on with the detention center now, with robust programming and individualized services. But it is, I think, a needed level of service for communities.
Great, thank you. Earl and Mike, anything to add?
I will say that we are fully committed to trying to reduce the disparities of the race and ethnicity of the kids that go to detention. Many of the programs that I described before are a direct result of our efforts to do that. We have a detention diversion program, which our youth can be released to in lieu of going to detention, and that program serves largely minority youth as a way to avoid placement in secure detention. I want to go back to the structure of that question because I said, why would we keep it open? Because the center detains youth. The center is, the Juvenile Detention Center makes no decision about who is placed in their facility. It is the court systems of Arlington, Falls Church, and the City of Alexandria that make the decisions around who is placed in detention. So it's not a choice the center has. They accept youth that are sent to them by the juvenile justice system. And I think our juvenile justice system is where the efforts to reduce disparities belongs. And I think we have engaged that process. We hope to lead it. I think we've made great headroads in reducing the number of kids. Historically, the number of youth that have been placed at detention has historically been minority youth. And the overall reduction of that number of youth is a very positive thing. So I think we're going to continue to work in that regard. We're committed to it. We want to engage the community in options. And the youth that that are placed at detention are youth that generally are the ones that commit violent felonies and present a risk to the community. So it's really our effort to keep detention only to those small group of youth that really present a threat to the community and need to be there just long enough to get some resources in place and transition back to their families and their communities.
Jennifer, I would just add, I agree with what Earl said, and I also want to mention that, of course, juvenile justice is one part of the fabric about racial and ethnic disparity, and we're pleased to be a part of the efforts in the city, in the area, in the region, and to move on equity matters, being a part of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity and leadership in government and supported and championed by elected bodies to make equity issues a paramount concern. And so we are also very committed to this.
Great, thank you. Well, we find ourselves at the end of our time, and I believe we've answered every question that has come in as well. So I'd like to thank all the folks who have been speaking here tonight, and also thank those who joined on Facebook or YouTube. Thank you for texting in all the good questions. The final report, the full report, is also available on the project webpage. I believe that should be showing on the slide or on the video right now. There's also a form there for any additional questions you may have. And of course, tonight's session will be there as well in the next day or so. We'll post a link to this session in case you missed it or you want to go back and look at a question that you may have missed. So again, thanks to everybody. I know that there will be some recommendations coming forward and shared with the City of Alexandria and Arlington County as a follow-up to this report in the coming months. But until then, I hope that everyone has a wonderful evening. And again, thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.